Well, welcome to the Inspired Wild podcast. We are here in No Limits Archery, Denver, Colorado. Nice snowy morning out here. Beau Thiry, that's how you pronounce your last name, right?
Correct.
Thiry? Okay.
Yep.
Beau has been kind enough to come into the shop early today before it even opens. And we're going to kind of go through an arrow build. I think this is going to be the first in a series of more technical podcasts that we're going to try to launch here. Also with us is Kyle McKell. Is that how you say your last name?
Yeah, Michael,
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Kyle's running on zero sleep because it was snowing for the last, 16 hours?
Yeah.
You've been plowing all night, haven't you?
Yeah. It's been good.
So if Kyle passes out in the corner, we'll just...
take a 30-minute nap, like you said.
There you go. That's fine. So we do need to honor Beau's time today because, like we said, we're in the shop today. Business hours are going to open in a little bit, and you have to open the doors for customers.
Yes, I do. I'll be doing stuff like this all day today, every day, it seems like.
So we're going to focus on building arrows today.
Yep.
We're kind of walk through the process of, say someone out there gets a box of arrows, like what's the first step? And then we're going to take that all the way to the conclusion of an arrow that's ready to shoot out your bow. How many, just a little side note, on an average week, how many arrows do you build?
Oh, geez. I've never counted. But I'll tell you what, during the busy season, that our archery season starts in September, so that June, July, August, everybody getting ready for archery elk and antelope and deer and stuff. But usually that time of year, I'd say I probably build 20 dozen plus arrows a day. A lot of those are pre-fletched. Mm-hmm. So, coming in the box from the manufacturers, already ready to go. We just help them work through what exactly they're hunting, how heavy does their arrow ideally want to be for their particular draw length in the bow that they shoot. And then that'll help us obviously determine the arrow. Once that arrow is determined, like I said, if it's pre-fletched, it's quick. I can put it on the arrow saw, cut it real quick to length, and then, insert it up, and they're kind of out the door. Aside from hopefully they bring their bow in. So if you're listening to this and you're going to come by the shop, please bring your bow. That way I can help you select your arrow length. And I can also tune your bow and make sure that arrow's performing properly out of that bow.
Well, let's start there. Say someone does come in, they've got their bow, they've got a dozen arrows. In this case, we've got a couple blank shafts from Victory. That first step, you said finding the length of the arrow. Like, well, how do you determine that? What does that look like?
So depending upon the arrow shaft manufacturer, most manufacturers are going to offer a tune chart. Okay, a lot of times it's on the back of the box, or they'll send out a lot of these shops such as ours here will get a booklet. Okay. And it'll have the tune chart in it for each specific arrow. So like Victory, for instance, Victory's awesome with it. They actually make a tune chart for every specific arrow model that they build.
Oh, really?
Okay. Where, Easton does that at times as well. But for the most part, a lot of their hunting arrow selection charts, it's a broad spectrum. Okay, it's there for Axis arrows, full metal jackets, their hex, and so on and so forth. Or like I said, Victory will offer a arrow chart for each specific arrow. VAPs have their own chart, RIPs have their own chart, all that stuff, which is really cool. They also, in that chart, are going to specify components that fit in those arrows. So they have some components that fit in those arrows that are heavier. They'll be made of steel. Okay. When you add a lot of weight to the front of an arrow shaft, what happens is it makes the arrow act weaker. Okay. So I have to take that into account when I try to figure out somebody's arrow length. And the reason for it is if I have somebody that comes in that has a really long draw length and they want to put a lot of weight up front, well, off the bat, I already know his arrow's going to be fairly long because he's a big guy or gal.
Sure.
Okay. But I know that they're going to have, a fairly long arrow, and the longer that arrow is, okay, the less weight I can really put on the end of it because there's more material to flex. Okay, as I cut the arrow down, it gets stiffer. So for myself, I have a fairly short draw length. Well, some people would say average, but I got about a 28-inch draw length, 28 and a half, depending upon the bow. But in that particular setup, I know, in the way I like to cut my arrows, I know I can cut them really short. I'll actually cut them really close to my launcher. So my arrow rest, specifically speaking, the launcher comes out and lifts my arrow. I want the end of my arrow or the end of my component of that arrow, because all components fit differently, to be about a 1/4 inch in front of my launcher.
Okay.
That's me though, okay? What a lot of people don't realize is when you do that, it brings that broadhead back inside the riser, okay, and above your hand. So if you're holding the bow incorrectly, you're going to come back to me looking like my old shop teacher missing a finger. So you got to keep that in mind. If you're holding the bow with a relaxed hand and your fingers are down, you can get away with that. I personally recommend to most that come in here to cut our arrows at the end of the riser or an inch in front.
Okay.
Somewhere in that realm.
Helps, yeah.
The reason for that is I don't have to worry about you coming back looking like my shop teacher.
You get enough clearance.
Exactly. Yeah. You get enough clearance. It also allows for a bigger broadhead. A lot of guys like to shoot bigger broadheads. I'm on the smaller broadhead side of things. I find they seem to fly a little bit better and easier to tune. But for those that like to shoot a big 1.25 inch fixed blade head, I have to worry about obviously clearance from the riser. So that arrow length also, is a factor to make sure they can shoot those heads.
Let's talk about the cutting itself. You guys obviously do lots, thousands of arrows, so it makes sense for you to have a good saw. But what about someone at home? Like, does it make sense for them to have a saw? What kind of saw should they be picking up?
There's, in my mind, there's two thoughts on that. Most people aren't going to cut enough arrows to justify buying a saw. Personally, the reason why I say that is, like, for instance, for us here, I know we charge, if somebody comes in with a set of arrows that didn't come from us and they want us to cut them, we charge 50 cents a cut. Okay, on the lower end for arrows or arrow saws, that I can think of off the top of my head, there used to be a couple saws out there. You could buy them for like $150. Okay. That's a lot of arrows to make up $150, right? Now, the second thought process to that is, for a guy that wants to be solely independent or is far enough away from an archery shop, I mean, I talk to guys that come down here from Wyoming, talk to guys from, Nebraska, even Kansas, where they're like, hey, I don't have anything near me. Right. We come all the way to Denver to get our bows worked on or get arrows and all this other stuff.
That makes sense.
For those guys, to buy a $150 saw where they can, have the saw at home, learn how to use it, order arrows online and be solely sufficient. For those guys, it makes sense. But for the vast majority, I would say it's probably not worth it.
Okay. I totally get that. Or maybe you've got a big family, all your kids shoot. Yeah. Or you got, a bunch of, like you said, maybe a couple buddies go together and pitch in for the saw together.
And that's a great point that I didn't think about. Yeah, get a bunch of guys together to do it. Target archers, if anybody's listening to this that are really getting into target archery, that's another exception. I'd probably buy a saw. Specifically for the aspect, if you are going to mess around with different arrow setups, you will drive guys in the shop nuts. Specifically if you shoot recurve bows, not picking on recurve shooters, but compound guys aren't so bad, because it's a kind of a cut once, cut twice type thing, to try to figure out the length and the point weight that works the best. But for recurve shooters, arrow stiffness is super critical. So I mean, I get times where I'll have some Olympic recurve shooters in here, and they'll hand me an arrow and I'll cut it, and I'll see them a week later and they want me to cut an 1/8 inch off. I'm like, really?
It's that precise, huh?
It's that precise on some of those bows. So for those, yes, get a saw. For the average guy or somebody that's close to a shop, I wouldn't worry too much. I can help you out.
Sure. Okay, so you get your arrows cut.
Yep.
And next step after that?
Yeah, so assuming that this arrow's cut, this is a brand new arrow, but assuming that it was cut, we had the length chosen. First thing I always do is I'll grab a silver Sharpie, okay? The reason why I do that is I'm actually going to color the end of the arrow shaft. By coloring the end of the arrow shaft, I'll be able to put it on a square, okay, and make sure that the end of that arrow is perfectly true, okay? The reason why we need to do this is arrow saw does a great job of cutting the arrow and cutting it arrow fairly true, but the downside is if the arrow's supported on one end, okay, in the knock receiver of the saw, and then you're holding onto the arrow shaft and applying pressure onto the blade. Well, depending upon the stiffness of the arrow and where exactly you're holding it, okay, it's going to cause the arrow to flex slightly, okay, and give you an off cut. Okay, it won't be perfectly 90 degrees. So we want to make sure that the end of this arrow is perfectly square. And the reason for that is, like I said, when we go to put a component on there, any kind of insert or collar system, if that arrow's not square and there's any type of slop inside the arrow shaft and its component fit, as small as just a couple thousandths, which really, I mean, it's really a micro measurement. But even just a couple thousandths will kick that insert, that collar, whatever it may be, whatever the component is, it'll kick it off a true. And then when we go to put broadheads on it, broadheads start to wobble, and that makes it even worse.
It just exaggerates it even more.
Exactly. Stacking, tolerances on top of each other. Well, when you do that, you have very little room for error. So there's a couple different arrow saws on the market, arrow squares on the market. This one here is made by G5. It's an absolute phenomenal square. Another one that we use here at the shop is actually made by Luminoc. Most people know them for their lighted nocks, but they actually make a pretty awesome square. But anyway,
and those aren't that expensive.
No,
right?
not
so
at all.
You definitely recommend get your own square.
Get your own square for sure. If you're doing anything with components, okay, even if you go to a shop and get your arrows cut and you want to assemble everything else, put your inserts in or anything like that, absolutely have a square. Okay. Absolutely, hands down. The G5 square, I want to say it's like $35 or $40 the last time I looked. It's been a long time, but I don't think it's really gone up. Unfortunately, off the top of my head, the square from Luminoc, I couldn't tell you. Okay. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. But anyway, I like the Luminoc square personally. G5 actually just did come out with a new square, so this one might be kind of phasing out, but their new square is absolutely dynamite. But anyway, so I'll go ahead and lay the arrow down on the square. And all I'm doing is I'm essentially just rolling that arrow across the square. There's a little abrasion, on the end of this. This particular one here allows you to select what type of grit sandpaper you want to use. And that sandpaper sticks right onto that block. And that's what will file down the end of that arrow shaft and get it perfectly square. The G5 squares have two-sided cutting bit. One side's for aluminum, the other side's for carbon. That particular one works absolutely phenomenally. Allows me to, like I said, if somebody comes in with like an aluminum shaft, I can cut it really, really well. The sandpaper works well, but it's not great. Okay. Right. Now, obviously, we talked about putting the silver Sharpie on there. That silver Sharpie's completely gone, as you can see, 100% square. I know it's square because the Sharpie's gone. Okay, it's cut it all down, and allow me to fit a component to a direct one-to-one fit and no slop on the end of that shaft.
Cool.
Okay. Now that that's done, you could install inserts right away. You don't have to. I usually end up just kind of bouncing around. Inserts are generally one of my last things I'll do. But just to show you, on this particular arrow shaft, it uses what's called a half out, meaning half of the insert is exposed on the exterior of the arrow shaft. This one here, for this gold tip, I believe this was a RIP TKO. Yep. This insert here is made of aluminum. They make a 60 grain steel version, but that'll just slide right in the end of that arrow, real nice and tight. Okay, and it fits like a glove. I should have an arrow spinner here because you could see the actual fit. But anyway, Garrett, if you could grab me that. Grab me the one just to the left of that, please. Thank you. So this arrow spinner is going to allow me to test that fit between the component and the arrow shaft. Now, this is a 1/1000th arrow shaft, so it should spin fairly true. The arrow shaft itself, because of its overall length, there may be a slight bit of wobble in it. But if we look at this particular one, laser straight, that insert spinning really true. And I know with a good quality broadhead on there, that broadhead should spin true too.
Nice.
And fly quite well, make it easy to tune.
Once you're done squaring it up, you've put it through either the Luminoc or the G5 device. Do you have to clean it at all?
Yeah.
Do you get little carbon dust in there that have to get removed?
Exactly. So in that instance, Q-tip works perfectly, depending upon the arrow diameters. Like micro diameter arrows, 1/66s, Victory Vaps, Easton injections, gold tip pierces. A Q-tip can be difficult to slide in there. But you always want to use some sort of solvent to try to help pick up any of that any of that dust.
In this case, you're using
In this case, I'm using acetone.
Gotcha.
Yep. I'll use acetone in this case. I've used rubbing alcohol before.
Okay.
Acetone just has a tendency, we keep it a lot here around the shop. And the reason why we do that is it helps us clean up any kind of glue residue. If we were starting with an already fletched arrow and we're doing a fletching repair, it'll allow us to go ahead and clean off excess glue on the exterior of the shaft, and I'm not going through as much.
That makes sense.
As much rubbing alcohol. But you can see how much dust came out of the inside of that arrow shaft. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, really critical to clean the inside of the arrow. If we don't do that, the glue has a tendency to just bind to the dust. Okay, and that dust obviously is not solid, right? Yep. So a lot of people that have issues, if you've built your own arrows before and you're listening, if you're having issues with tips pulling out, okay, or your inserts, whether it be half out or anything like that, chances are it's not getting thoroughly cleaned. Okay, so running a Q-tip down there with some rubbing alcohol or acetone is perfect.
Sure.
All right. Like I said, I already showed you the fit there. There's multiple different types of glue you can use to fit an insert like this. I use here at the shop insert weld glue. Works phenomenal. It comes in a little, 1 ounce tube, just like this. Lasts us, we build a bunch of arrows, but it really does not take much glue to work. So just like any super glue, less is more, generally speaking.
Gotcha. Let me stop you right there. Before you're actually gluing in the insert, say you do your spin test and it's not perfect, like laser straight, like you were saying. There is a little bit of wobble. What are some troubleshooting options you can look at that point?
So depending upon the arrow and component fit, it could be just as simple as the component having a little bit of slop in it. Okay. If it's that, what I have a tendency to do, like in this instance, we went ahead and put this arrow on and I spun it and it spun true, right? I'm happy with that fit. Now I may be able to put that arrow or that component on another arrow that isn't quite as true, or the components don't mesh very well. Now in this instance, like I said, this is a RIP TKO Elite, so it's a 1000 straightness, so it's really high quality, and Victory does a good job with their components. So in this instance, this one's spinning just as well, and heck, I haven't even squared it yet, so that's really awesome. Okay. But at times, I'll get an arrow that doesn't spin as true, and I'll get a component that isn't quite perfect. Yep. Well, sometimes I can go ahead and I can sort through them, and I'll find which component fits best with what arrow. And then there's always the exception where, for whatever reason, it is just the component and all your arrows are awesome, which we all hope they are. And you kind of have to just live with it a little bit. Set it aside, use it as an arrow that you practice with. For the actual shooting and tuning application, the arrows themselves with a field point on it will fly just fine. Nice. It's just something that maybe I'll change the color of the knock, or I'll mark it and I'll just use it for a range arrow. All right. But anyway, multiple glues. Like I said, we went over the insert weld. There's a glue that I really like to use if I'm experimenting with components. And that glue would be, was a huge block of it. It's made by Boning. It's called Cool Flex. And it's essentially like a glue stick, for like a hot glue gun.
Sure.
Okay. You heat up the glue, you'll work it onto the component, and then you'll wave that glue over the flame, making sure it stays soft, and then you'll go ahead and insert that. Okay. The benefit to using a component like that, a glue like that, and the reason why I like to use a glue like that is that if for whatever reason I ding up my component, like a half out, they can bend. Okay, they can. Most of the time, I don't have any issues with it. But if you hit something really hard, a lot of times the component could bend. And if the component bends, I can heat it up and pull it out. I can inspect the arrow. If the arrow's still in good shape,
oh, I see.
I can go ahead and replace the component, and I'm back 100%.
Nice.
So that's what I like about using the Cool Flex. I also like to use it on target shafts. And the reason why I use it on target shafts is I'll be able to pull out a glue in point if it gets dinged up, or if I need to pull that glue in point out and add weight to it. I could either replace the point or add weight, depending upon what kind of systems they use. Cool. But anyway, that's the two glues that I use predominantly. Allows me to like I said, fluctuate with components, especially like in these arrows with multiple different insert systems. I can put the lighter inserts in, a couple of them. I can put heavier inserts in another one, and test them out and see which ones seem to perform best for me. All right, so once we have the component on here with whatever glue you choose to use, okay, we have to get the fletchings on. Okay, now fletchings are going to be dependent upon what kind of broadhead you use. Now, in order to not take up too much time, we're going to just go ahead and jump right into it with an arrow or a fletching made by AAE. This one happens to be a Max Stealth. This is what I would suggest for most people using fixed blade broadheads. They make a multitude of different sizes, but this vein has a tendency to be our most popular with Western big game bow hunters hunting a lot of elk. A lot of guys like to use the fixed blades.
Yep.
The jig I'm going to show you how to use today is going to be made by Bitzenberger. We do carry these here at the shop. It's the jig that we use for all of our fletching needs here. Heck, I've got 5 of them, I think, sitting down here below the counter. I went ahead and grabbed a brand new jig in order to be able to show you all who can watch this how to actually set the jig up. Okay, so on the bottom of the jig, first of all, there's 3 little set screws. Okay, those 3 set screws are there in order for you to select whether you want to run a 3 fletch or a 4 fletch. Okay, in this particular instance with this vein size, I find a 3 fletch to work great with most setups. So that's what I had set it to. But essentially in the Bitzenberger jig, there's a little Allen wrench. It drops right inside one of those set screws. You'll tighten it up to select your specific need. Yeah. Like I said, the next one would be next to a 4 fletch. You'd essentially just drop it in the 3 fletch configuration. You'd back it out. And then you'd go ahead and set it in the 4 fletch, turn it in, and that would be allowing you to select what 3 or 4 fletch, what fletching configuration you would prefer. Okay. Now this one, like I said, is already set to 3 fletch. Now it's a brand new jig, has never fletched an arrow yet. So what I need to do is I need to go ahead and select the degree of angle that the jig is set at in order to make sure the vein sits fully on the arrow shaft. So on the jig, you'll see these 2 little knobs on here. Okay, I've already loosened them up so you can see the jig actually move. Okay, that helps set that vein onto the arrow shaft properly. Now this particular jig I grabbed is a right helical jig. I personally like to use a helical jig whenever possible, but because the clamp itself has a twist to it, okay, I can't set the jig up perfectly evenly, okay, and expect the entire vein to fit, okay? Yep. And I'll try to eyeball it real quick so you guys can see that. Let's see if there it goes. So if I set it up perfectly straight, slid some. A lot of times, the front of the vein on a lot of these helical jigs won't even be touching the arrow shaft. Okay, that's a problem. We need to have...
I can see a little bit of a gap in there.
Exactly. We need to be able to have that base of that vein seat on that arrow shaft completely. Okay, that way we make sure that glue is adhering that vein, no problem. Right. We don't have any issues. So in this instance, I'm going to go ahead and rotate the clamp forward in that on the front side of the vein in order to make sure that I'm going to get complete adhesion and that vein sits fully. Now, once I find that position, I will go ahead and tighten up this little bolt right here and make sure that's nice and firm. You don't have to torque it down real hard.
And that just locks that dial in place so that it doesn't move and it's repetitive for every arrow you're going to do.
Exactly. It allows me to go ahead and fletch that arrow, make sure it's that fletching is gonna sit on there well, and it allows it to be locked down to where if I ever needed to repair it, I can exactly duplicate it.
Gotcha.
I can exactly duplicate it. Now there is a way, and I've done this here at the shop multiple times for customers coming in. There is a way to set up one of these jigs where you can literally fletch any diameter arrow with any fletching. They always fit. Okay. Now it doesn't allow you to fluctuate with the amount of offset or helical, but it does allow you to, no matter what arrow you shoot, you can always replicate it, and it's not like, oh shoot, where was it set up before? But anyway, this particular jig now, like I said, I've set the angles. I'll back the vein off a touch so you can see that the vein's not touching the arrow shaft, I'll work it right back down, and you'll see that vein fits the entire arrow shaft. The base covers completely. There's no lifted edges or anything of that nature. So I know once I apply some glue, I've got 100% contact with the base of that vein and the arrow shaft, and it should adhere quite well. Now, one of the reasons why I chose AAE vanes for this particular podcast is AAE is very critical on arrow cleaning. Okay. If you do not use their process, they will not stick.
Really?
I promise you. Okay. So they offer a adhesion kit. It's $25-$30, I believe. It's going to come with the wipes. It's going to come with a primer pen and a 1 ounce bottle of their Max Bond glue. If you use those 3 items together in the correct order, take everything in a Mack truck to pull these things off.
Nice.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open this up here. I'm going to grab one wipe. And the one wipe will cover a dozen arrows. So, I mean, there's like 20 wipes in there. So you've got, more than enough wipes to do a bunch, especially if you're fletching for a bunch of buddies or your family or anything like that.
So you're just going to wipe it down and then let it dry.
Exactly. Wipe it down, let it dry. It doesn't take very long for the cleaner from the wipe to dry. I'll go ahead and wipe both of these arrows down. It doesn't take very long for that to dry at all. And I'll show you how quickly all this stuff bonds. It's really quite amazing, actually. But anyway, like I said, one wipe would generally work on a dozen arrows. I recommend when you take the wipes, heck, you can see the amount of a little bit of dust that came off of that arrow shaft.
2 arrows, it picked up quite a bit of stuff.
Exactly. I recommend, though, when you do open up the wipes, it does have the little deal to seal it back up. Slide that in a Ziploc bag. Okay.
Just so it doesn't dry out.
Just so it doesn't dry out. I know it's sealed, but they do have a tendency to dry out. We use them enough here at the shop that rarely ever do I have a pack dry out before I wear out of veins. Now, for instance, I wipe these down. Heck, they're already almost completely dry. This one's actually dry enough that I could start fletching.
And do you recommend that people do one at a time when they clean it, or clean all 12, hang them off something, and then?
You can clean all 12. The biggest thing you need to realize that the cleaner's there to remove the dust and remove any oil. Okay. There's a lot of oil on your hands. Okay. So, you just got to realize once you wipe them down where your veins are getting applied, don't touch it. Okay. If you're going to grab the arrow and you need to manipulate it, grab it by the knock and grab it by a section that is not going to have a vein contact. That way we know it's completely clean. Okay. Now, at the veins, when we do the primer on the veins, I recommend really doing the veins one at a time. Okay. The reason for that is it's a chemical bond between the primer, the glue, and a little bit of the wipe. Okay. There's tiniest bit of residue from that wipe, the tiniest bit. But there's a little bit of a chemical reaction between those that really allow it to adhere and adhere really quickly. So, when you do the wipes, the pen, you put a vein in the clamp, okay? You squeeze a clamp, obviously the clamp opens up. You'll drop that vein inside there. There's multiple hash marks on the clamp itself, and that'll help you determine what height you may want it at, and you'll be able to replicate that every time. In this instance, I think I'm going to go with the 3rd line. Now let's go to the 2nd line. I think that's where I originally started setting up that jig.
Does it make a big difference, really, how far the fletching is from the knock, or is just consistency the most important?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
Consistency obviously is a big deal. The reason why we want to pay attention to the hash marks, though, if we fletch too far back, okay, and this may take some trial and error. So for those fletching arrows, you might want to fletch one where you think you may want the vein. Have somebody there with you, okay? And the reason why I say this is you're going to knock that arrow onto the bowstring. You're going to draw the bow back and anchor like you were to shoot. Generally speaking, I like to have a buddy there to be able to look to see where the veins are in correspondence to my face, okay?
I got you.
I don't want the vein to contact my face. Okay, if that fletching contacts my face or any portion of that arrow contacts my face, I'm actually going to apply a little bit of a lateral pressure to that arrow, and that's going to affect accuracy. So you may have to fletch them far enough forward to where they clear your face and you maximize accuracy. But ideally, because of fletchings create drag, and it's actually kind of working off of leverage, okay, in correspondence with the tip, the further your veins are fletched back, generally the quicker they stabilize. It's like instantaneous.
That makes sense.
I shouldn't say instantaneous, but they will stabilize quicker. Okay, the further they are back. But like I said, don't let them touch your face. All right. So in this instance, I chose the notch that I wanted the vein to be sitting on in the clamp. You can see that vein is pressed into that clamp completely, and only the base of the vein is exposed.
Yep.
From here, I'll use the primer pen. Like I said, when we fletch these arrows, you only use the primer pen, each individual arrow, close it back up, go again. Do not try to do a bunch. The reason for it is as you put the vein in there and you're trying to move it, you're going to set your thumb on top of that vein to slide it around in the clamp and get it in the position you want it. You're going to get oil on it. Okay, so it's gonna struggle to stick. But the AAE primer pen, we're just gonna work that across the vein a couple times. There's a little felt applicator on the end. I just need to make sure that there's a little bit of, let's see if it's coming out there. It's coming a little bit. Making sure that it is applying the solution. It doesn't take a lot. Real thin film. That's all it really takes. We'll run it across the vein once, twice. I did it a bunch of times there just to make sure that I had some cleaner coming out.
And you put the cap back on the pen.
And I put the cap back on the pen so it doesn't dry out. That way it's ready for the next one, hopefully. Now the Max Bond glue. This is where I find a lot of people will overdo it when they're trying to fletch arrows. It really doesn't take a lot of glue. When it comes to any kind of super glues, less is more. So I actually will just do a couple drops on the base of the vein, and then I'll spread it. Okay, I know a lot of guys will recommend doing a full bead. I find that to be more glue than is necessary. In this instance, I've got 5 drops on there, and I'll go ahead and just use the end of that glue bottle and spread that glue out. You could use, a Q-tip or anything like that, but that's going to soak up some of that glue. So I just like to use that glue bottle and just kind of smear that glue around a little bit. And then I'll go ahead and place it on the jig. Now the jig's magnetic. Okay, you could just hear it, boom, it picked up that jig. So once I go ahead and clip it onto that magnet, as you can see, I leave the vein off of the arrow shaft until I know that jig is completely stuck to that magnet. I'll slide the jig all the way back, okay, to the back side of the knock receiver, and then I'll go ahead and work that jig down. Now in order for me to keep this clean, I'm going to turn it a little bit. And then I'll slide it right on down and make sure that vein is seated completely. Now in this instance here, you can see there's a little bit of glue that came out from the base of the vein. That was only 5 drops. If I ran a full bead, I'd have glue everywhere.
Probably be dripping down.
Oh yeah, I'd have glue everywhere. So 5 drops, like I said, is really all you need. And then from this position here, you could wait a little while and then pop the clamp off and wipe the glue off. I'm going to wipe the glue off now, at least on this side, and just keep it as clean as I possibly can. Boom, that vein is on there. Now, a lot of guys will wait 30 seconds to a minute before they pull it off. I find that this glue will adhere that vein so quickly, 10 to 15 seconds.
Oh, yeah.
Is all I really need. And realistically,
and then you're cleaning up the other side right away.
Exactly. I'm cleaning up the other side. But like I said, I don't know how long it's been since I applied that. You can see how hard that vein is already on there.
That's not coming off.
That probably hadn't even been a minute.
Right.
So like I said, when you use it properly, it's everything and a Mack truck to pull these things off. So I'll go ahead and slide this arrow right back into that jig. Okay, that's where it was set up when I went ahead and dropped the clamp down. Now I'm going to go ahead and rotate that. We had already set it for a 3 fletch. There's a little detent in here. It tells you exactly where to stop. Okay, so I felt it click, hit that detent, and I'll go ahead and apply the next vein. Myself personally, because I'm a little OCD, I like to double check to make sure that I have it lined up exactly where I want it. I'm using that line on the clamp to correspond with my fletching, but I want to make sure that it's exactly the same. That right there, I could live with.
Cool. So then you're putting on the other veins that are required. In this case, 2 more veins. If you were doing a 4 fletch, you'd have 4 more veins.
Maybe 3 more. Yep.
Or 3
more veins. Yep.
And just keep going through there. So if, let's say you're practicing with broadheads and you clip one of the fletchings on another arrow and you need to remove that vein and replace it, what are your options? Or don't you have it?
You do. Generally speaking, you can use a X-Acto knife. Okay, a little razor blade knife. You can use a really fairly sharp pocket knife, and you can actually scrape them off, cut them off. Okay. On an arrow like this is a woven arrow. I don't like to do that on woven arrows. So generally speaking, on a woven arrow shaft, I would actually fletch on an arrow wrap. Okay, and an arrow wrap is a vinyl sticker. Okay, that essentially you'll roll the arrow across. You'll clean that wrap just like you would with the wipes, and you'd fletch directly to the vinyl.
That makes sense.
Okay, by fletching directly to vinyl on a woven arrow, all I have to do is scrape off the vinyl. I don't have to scrape the glue off the carbon. Okay, the reason why scraping glue off of a woven arrow, a carbon woven arrow, is an issue is the glue obviously is designed to stick. It wants to stay. So when you start to scrape on that, if you get a little too aggressive, you actually dig into the carbon.
Yeah, you're removing content of the arrow.
Exactly. Once you have damaged the carbon itself, the structural integrity of that arrow is gone. Okay? So it's very critical on carbon arrows to know that they are 100% just like they were, from the factory.
Sure.
Okay? If there's nicks, cuts, chips, cracks, they're gone. Incredibly dangerous to shoot an arrow that's damaged.
So in the case of you ruin one fletching by shooting it with another arrow, what you're doing is taking a razor blade, a really sharp knife, you're removing that entire wrap and then starting over.
Yeah.
But at least you have a structurally intact arrow to, okay.
Exactly. Now you don't have to. I know a lot of folks out there don't like wraps. They like to adhere directly to the carbon because there is times where you hit something hard enough with the fletching and the vinyl will tear and you're starting over again. A lot of people don't like to do that extra work to replace that wrap. But I find in order to save arrows, generally the best way to go.
That makes sense.
Now you can, like I said, you can scrape them off of a woven arrow. I don't love it. You can, but I have a tendency to get a little frustrated because the glue doesn't want to move, and then I get a little too overzealous and end up cutting into that carbon. So I try to refrain from cutting them off as much as possible. So here's that last vein. This one here, I'll try to somewhat count and see how long it took for it to stick. So I just went ahead and applied the primer. I'm putting on a couple drops. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll do 5. I did 6 on that last one. 5 was more than enough. Spread that around, just like I mentioned earlier. And then I'll go ahead and stick this down. Now, once I stick it down and it touches the arrow shaft, I'll start counting a little bit. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I pulled that clamp off. I went ahead and wiped this real quick. Wipe the other side.
Yeah, that's not much time at all.
No.
That goes fast.
I mean, that was like I said, 8 seconds. Now it's obviously been a little bit longer. And again, everything.
You're flexing the arrow to the point of it almost.
Yeah, I mean, everything
and it's not coming
in a
off.
Mack truck, and it's not coming off.
Nice.
And you can see how clean that is. I mean, no excess glue.
That's impressive.
All the veins are, just lined up just about perfectly. And that arrow essentially indexed the knock, and that arrow is good to go. Okay. Now, the one thing I did neglect to mention on this particular arrow is it is spine aligned. Okay. Victory spine aligns their arrows, so not a lot of other manufacturers do that. So when I put an arrow shaft in a jig and fletch it, I try to look where that spinal line mark is on this particular arrow. You can see they actually label that. I try to somewhat orient the cock vein or your index vein, okay, in order to match them all exactly the same.
Sense.
Okay. So this arrow here, essentially, assuming we went ahead and put the component in right away, and we gave either the Cool Flex glue time to cure, which it just needs to cool down. That's all. You can run it under some cold water and it's ready to go.
Nice.
The insert weld that we use takes about 10-15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
You could be shooting the arrow in the same day.
All right.
So this one would be ready to go. It would be ready to shoot through the bow, through some paper, make sure it's coming out of the bow properly, and then sighting it in.
Cool. So one other quick question I have, and then I know we have to be conscious of your time because you got to open the doors here to the store pretty soon.
Yeah.
You spent a lot of time squaring up the front of the arrow where the outsert or insert is going to go. Mm-hmm. What about squaring up the back where the knock is?
Yeah, so generally speaking, 100%, yes, I would do that. In this instance, for time, I went ahead and just did the front because that allowed me to get that done and everybody got to see it, or at least hear about it. In this particular instance with this square, which is the reason why I like it so much. Mm-hmm. Okay, now like I said, G5 did change their square, and I believe you can do this on the new square now. I should call my buddy Brian over there and see what he's got to say. But this particular squaring device would allow me, if I forgot, like in this particular instance, I didn't do it for time, but it sounds like we have just a touch.
To square it with the fletchings on.
I can still square it. Now, I'm only going to take this one like one rotation around, and I want to see if this was off of square. Sure enough. Perfect. You can see that tiny little silver dot on there. Okay, there's a little divot in that. So this particular jig allows me to set it up to where even after it's fletched, so even if you bought pre-fletched arrows, you could square them. You'd know they're perfect. I'll take this just a couple quick passes real lightly. And it should, there's quite the ding in that one. It should square it right on up. Yeah, there's quite the ding. And then I'd be able to go ahead and reinstall the knock.
So you'll square it to the point where all that silver Sharpie's gone, and then you'll clean it like you did before, and then put the knock back in.
Yep. Okay. Now on this particular side, I don't have to be as conscious of how much dust is in there because the knock itself is press fit. Okay. There's no glue that's trying to hold it in, and realistically, the tension of the knock being press fit in there is all it needs to stay.
Nice.
And they're pretty firm. There it goes. I'll go ahead and index that knock with that fletching. Most bow setups, that would be odd vein up. Boom. And that one would be ready to go with an insert in it. And like I said, shoot it through paper and it's ready to rip. And then from there, once you get the bow sighted in, some broadhead tuning, but we can obviously go over something like that another time.
I agree. Yeah, I think we should do more of this.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we could call you. Yeah. And then we could do a podcast about it or put that information out there, but I'd rather hear it straight from you.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can speak much more intelligently than we can. So.
Yeah. Well, this is what I do. So, if it was the podcast side of things and the cameras and audio, I would be at loss. Nobody here would be listening to this. But yeah, this is what I do. Arrow builds, bow builds, stuff like that. So, for anybody that's listening that has questions, feel free to call No Limits Archery and ask for me, and I'll be happy to answer some questions for you, or talk about arrow builds, bow builds, stuff like that. I enjoy doing it.
Real quick, do you guys still offer the arrow building workshop?
We do. There's my phone. How close are we? Oh, we're there. Yeah, so we do. Here in just a little bit, we'll go ahead and get that up on our website and get that rolling.
Awesome.
So, awesome, guys.
Well, Beau, I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Thanks, dude.
Yeah, no problem.